I've got a question for you. No, seriously. I got a question for you. Who do you think is the most famous person on earth? Now, I can tell you what I think is interesting about your answers. They're all over the place. Some of you were shouting out the names of musicians, some of you were naming athletes, and some of you were saying YouTubers or actors or hosts of your favorite TV shows. You see, when it comes to something like fame, we all have different ideas of who's in first place. Why? Because each of us has a different idea of what's important. And what's important to me is catching all of these Swedish fish in my mouth. If you're not into sports, an NBA athlete isn't going to be a big deal to you. If you don't know much about fashion, you definitely don't know who the best designers are. And if you don't watch the Avengers movies, well, then you don't care much about the guy who plays Iron Man. All of these things may be popular, but they just aren't popular with you. And because of that, they don't have a lot of influence over your life. What do I mean by that? Well, influence is the ability to have an effect on someone else. It's the ability to affect someone else's behavior or their thoughts or choices. And while we may not all agree on who's popular in our world or culture, I think we can all agree on this. Popular people have influence. They have people's attentions. What they say and what they do matters to the people around them. And their popularity, well, it gives them the ability to lead or influence other people to change things about themselves, for better or for worse. I grew up in a time where it was cool to wear your t-shirts and your pants backwards. Listen, I'm not kidding you. It was a thing. I thought I was a miggity Mac. And boy, am I glad that those days are over. Can you imagine having to wear your pants and your shirts backwards? Here's the funny thing about influence. A lot of us may wonder if we have much of it. We think the ability to influence another person is something that only comes with fame or popularity. And those are two things most middle schoolers and even adults don't always feel like we have. Maybe you wonder how much influence you truly have because you aren't quite sure what you have to offer. You don't have it all figured out. And so you don't really know how you can lead or influence others. Even if you do have influence, what are you supposed to do with it? What direction are you supposed to be pointing other people? As a middle schooler, how do you even know to use whatever influence that you might have? Or maybe you see that you have influence, but you struggle with the fear of failure. You're afraid to actually take the steps and do it because you don't want to mess up, get rejected, or make the wrong move. Or maybe the pressure of influence is just too much for you. You see other people around you who have a lot of influence and are stepping up to lead, and honestly, it just looks like a lot of work. Their influence comes with so much pressure and attention, and you don't want to sign up for that. And then there are those of you who haven't really put a lot of thought into this whole influence thing. Sure, you see influencers on YouTube and Insta, but it never really occurred to you that you have the power to influence or lead others too. Here's the point. We tend to think of influence as this big, unattainable thing. It's something that we can't seem to reach ourselves. We're quick to recognize the influence that famous or popular or important people seem to have, but somehow we end up missing the potential we have to influence others. Questioning if we have the power to influence those around us isn't a new thing. In fact, people have been wondering about their potential to lead and influence others for a really long time. I'll show you what I mean. I want to look at an account from the Bible written by a guy named John. We're going to read about a time when Jesus was leading, serving, and living here on earth. And during his ministry, Jesus had a ton of influence on the people around him. And of course, there was no social media or internet at this time to measure his fame and popularity. But we do have the Gospels, the 4 accounts written about Jesus' life on earth in the Bible. These accounts give us plenty of insights into how many people sought out and followed Jesus while he was on earth. And Jesus didn't have influence during his life. 2,000 years after his death, people are still talking about him and following him. Now that's a lot of influence. The particular account we're going to look at took place in the midst of one of Jesus's influential moments. This was a moment where Jesus was talking to literally thousands of people who had come to hear what he alone had to say. He'd been teaching and doing a lot of miracles up to this point, and word has spread about him. His influence was growing, and now he had a massive crowd following him around because they couldn't wait to see what he would do next. When the story picks up, Jesus was focused on one thing in particular: feeding the people. And while I certainly appreciate a guy who's thinking about food, I can't imagine what it would be like to figure out how to feed thousands of people with nothing in front of you to start with. So let's see what happens. Then Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. There's a young boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that with this huge crowd? Tell everyone to sit down, Jesus said. So they all sat down on the grassy slopes. The men alone numbered about 5,000. Okay, let's pause here for a second. John wrote that there were about 5,000 men there. And that's just one part of the group of people. Imagine how much bigger that number had been if you counted the women and children. In the crowd, there was a young boy who had packed dinner. The only problem? This kid only packed a few loaves of bread and some fish. He didn't come prepared to feed thousands. He just came with that little that he had for himself. Here's what happened. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks to God, and distributed them to the people. Afterwards, he did the same with the fish, and they all ate as much as they wanted. After everyone was full, Jesus told his disciples, "Now gather the leftovers so that nothing is wasted." So they picked up the pieces and filled 12 baskets with scraps left to the people who had eaten from the 5 barley loaves. So the disciples took this young boy's food, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, right? And he gave it to Jesus. Jesus prayed over it and started handing it out. Now, if I were this kid, I'd probably be getting a little nervous. Not only did Jesus take his dinner, but he also expected it to be enough for every single person in the crowd to eat. That's just like me expecting these candy fish and Timbits to feed all of you. At first glance, this kid didn't seem to have enough to offer, enough to give, enough to do anything worthwhile for these people. He just had his dinner, and that was it. But still, this kid let Jesus use what he had. And what happened? Well, Jesus just kept passing and passing out enough food to feed every single person until they were full. And by the time everyone finished eating, there were still 12 baskets of leftovers. That's pretty cool, right? Now, there are so many amazing things about this story, but I want us to zoom in on just one part. And Jesus could have fed this huge crowd of hungry people any way he wanted to. He could have made it rain bread from heaven. That'd be pretty cool. He could have called the fish to flop out of the sea, but he didn't. Instead, he used the boy's dinner. The boy had just packed himself something to eat: 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. And that's what Jesus chose to feed everyone with. Jesus saw that the boy had something to give, and Jesus chose to use it to make an impact. By doing that, Jesus made this boy's dinner into so much more. Take a look at how this passage ends. When the people saw him do this miraculous sign, they exclaimed, "Surely he is the prophet we have been expecting." The people saw what Jesus did, with what this kid had brought, and because of it, they started to believe in him. Could Jesus have done this without the boy and all this bread and fish? Of course, but he chose to use someone who was willing to give what they had, no matter how little it may have seemed. You see, this kid was super important. I mean, well, he was at that point, but he wasn't super important or popular, and nobody might have even known his name. And he hadn't even intended to be influential. He just packed food for himself. But because he just brought what he had, Jesus allowed him to be a part of influencing thousands of people to believe. And that is pretty cool. If Jesus could use this young boy with his dinner to make a massive impact over 2,000 years ago, he can use you just as you are. He can use whatever you have to give right now to make an incredible impact today. Because just like this boy, Jesus can use whatever you have to do big things. You don't believe me? These past few months, like many of you, we've had a little bit more time in our hands, right? Because of this pandemic. And so I thought, man, there must be a lot of people out there that are stressed or tired of being indoors, so on and so on. But I decided to use my social media account to ask people if they needed food or if they needed anything or just even prayers. And I felt like what I had to offer was small, but when I had a few friends reach out to me and ask for prayers, and sometimes I feel like that was small, but it was a big deal for them. It meant a lot for them. And Jesus can use whatever you have to do big things. And for my friends, I had prayer. You see, you don't have to be popular or well-known or famous to have influence. You don't need to have the most followers on Instagram or the most views on TikToks to get it. You don't have to sit with the most people at lunch or be the one everybody wants to sit next to on the bus whenever we start to get on the bus again. You simply have to be willing to let Jesus use what you have. You have to be willing to give whatever you've got for the good of others. If you come to the table with that, I promise Jesus will use your influence to impact the people around you in the best ways. Jesus can use whatever you have to do big things. And today, I simply want to help you see that. And for some of you, maybe the best thing you can do is to begin to recognize the influence you do have. Maybe it's influence with your family or your teammates or a friend in your group. Or maybe it's just one close friend or one kid out of our church group or one younger sibling or one student from school. Either way, it's influence and you have it. It doesn't have to be thousands of people. It doesn't have to be dozens. If there's one person in your life who could lead towards something positive, well, that's influence. And if you're not sure, ask someone you trust to help you see it. A close friend or parent, an adult that you look up to. Ask them where they see you might have more potential to influence others than you actually realize. Then be willing to do something with what you have to offer. Maybe you have time to give your younger siblings, or offer to have lunch with a friend on Zoom, or spend the weekend with your family. Maybe you have a kind word to share with a teammate, or a sense of humor to make your mom or dad laugh, or an invitation to church for someone who might actually need it. Think about it. We all have something to offer others, and when we're willing to use what we have, that's influence. If you're not sure what you're going to give, again, asking someone close to you for an idea is a great place to start, because whether you realize it or not, you've definitely got something. Jesus can use whatever you have to do big things, and as we read today in our scriptures, just like Jesus turned a single meal into one that fed, thousands of people, right? He can use whatever you have to make a difference. As you continue on with your week, I don't know why I put this down, but I want you to grab some Swedish fish and some Timbits. And as you do, think about this question. What is one area I have influence in? See you later.